Thank you for tuning in to Ungentrified with Kent Johnson. Ungentrified takes an unfiltered view on pop culture, music, television and film, politics, current events, and topics central to the worldwide Black community. Ungentrified is a safe audio space for celebrating Black culture in its purest form. Thank you for joining Ungentrified with Kent Johnson. I'm your host, of course, Kent Johnson, and I have a really dope guest with me today. I'm going to forego what we normally do, which is talk about current events and go right into this because this man is on borrowed time and I want to get as much of the conversation as we can into this. So let's go ahead and get started. Why don't you tell the people who you are?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on the show. Really appreciate it. My name is Mario Rigby, born in Turks and Caicos Islands, but raised in Germany. And I just recently walked across Africa by foot and kayak. That took over 2.5 years.
Exactly. And that is the main reason why I brought Mario on today. I thought his story was incredible and I wanted to share his story with as many people as I could. So I thought, hey, why not bring him on Ungentrified? But Mario, before we go into your incredible story, I ask everyone who's a guest on the show what's on their radar at the moment. So it could be anything that is currently hot to you or something that's gotten your attention lately. It could be a book, an album. What's on your radar at the moment?
What's on my radar right now is people who are invested in solar, sustainable, and renewable energy, particularly in Africa, because I think this is the driving force that's going to take Africa to the next level when it comes to becoming a developing nation to becoming a developed nation.
Cool. I agree. I've seen a lot of growth in that area in various countries in Africa, which is great to see, and I can't wait to see what happens in the future with that. So it's good to hear that it's on somebody's radar.
Definitely, yeah.
So as Mario mentioned, he took this outstanding journey, and you started. This was in November of 2015. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, this was just around my birthday.
Well, that's a great birthday present to yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a 2-year trek across Africa. This came out to be around 12,000 miles that you did by foot in kayak.
Yeah, so it's 7,900 miles and 12,000 kilometers. The kayaking part was about 550 kilometers. So yeah, roughly around 300 something miles.
Wow. And to put that in perspective, the United States lengthwise is only 2,680 miles across. So for you to have done that many miles is crazy.
Actually, South Africa, I mean, I could technically have done America in, I would say, probably 3.5 months because it took me about 6 months to do South Africa, which took me about, it took me about 6 months to do that.
And these were the only two forms of transportation you had, were your 2 feet and the kayak.
Absolutely. There was a time where there's a conflict zone where I was forced to take military convoy, which covered over 100 kilometers. But that was the only time that I did not use feet or arms to cross Africa.
Okay, we're definitely gonna get into the conflict zone story, but
Absolutely.
take us back to the beginning, to before November 2015. What goes into planning this kind of trek, this kind of journey?
Yeah, you know what? That was actually really the interesting part that I thought was very fascinating. It was basically trying to find a way to do something that was quite impossible, and how do you implement that? How do you make that a possibility? And I never thought that limitations is something that should be in my radar, if you know what I mean by that. It was all about finding solutions for whatever problem there was in front of me. And so I spent a year trying to tackle those gaps that a lot of people thought were impossible. And I thought, okay, let's figure it out. Let's see if it's possible.
Because you basically dropped everything for this trip, right? Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Dropped the whole thing. I had a business going on. I had my own CrossFit gym and also an outdoor boot camp business. So I dropped everything and I said, you know what, I'm just going to go with that.
So how did your family and friends react when you started telling them, "Hey, leaving everything here, gonna hop over to South Africa and start this 2-year trek." What does that conversation look like?
Not too good. No, I'm just kidding. So actually, the first time I told my mom, she kind of froze on the phone and she was just like, you know what? You're my son, and if you're gonna do this expedition, you're gonna tell people about it. Be sure that if you break your leg or if you get hit by a car, be the first human being on the planet to walk or to wheelchair across Africa.
That's good. It's crazy. A lot of times what we see or hear about, especially in black families, whenever we talk about a trip that we're going on, there's always this cloak of fear that gets put over it. And in a lot of situations, I know you live in Canada now, but for us in the US, sometimes it's more dangerous for us to remain at home than it is to take these trips. So I can only imagine what your family and friends thought in your situation before you were taking that trip. I always get the, "Oh, be safe," or, "They do this here," or, "Did you hear about this?" And I'm like, "Well,
Yeah, I got a lot of that.
yeah."
And you know what? It wasn't really my family. It was just my friends, especially in the big cities, who are really kind of they were scared for me. You know, there were a lot of them were saying like, "Oh, what you're doing is crazy. You had a good thing going on. Why would you lose everything to go to the desert or to the jungle or something like that?" And you know, that kind of talk reiterated to me that I needed to do this more. So every time somebody would had like a negative thing to say about it, kind of motivated me to do it um, more strongly. So it was kind of motivation when people were against it or they thought it was a crazy idea.
Yeah, a lot of people are afraid to be pioneers in a space, or and not to be on point, but really to go out into the unknown frontier, and
Absolutely.
and be that first person. People don't see that for them, so they can't put the idea that you would want to do these things into their head because they couldn't see them possibly doing that. But there's always, I tell people this all the time, there's always somebody waiting for you to inspire them to do that thing. And
Exactly.
and you've gone out and done that for so many people. So tell me, okay, now it's November. You've landed in Cape Town was where you started off. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah, I started there. And so Cape Point is the most southwestern tip of Africa. So I began there. And I decided to follow just hug the coast. In fact, when I got there, I wasn't exactly sure how I was going to walk the route exactly because I felt like I needed to be there to figure out what's the best route by asking local people.
So how does that look? What does a typical day look like for you as you're making your way through this?
A typical day would be waking up at 4 a.m. and quickly pitching your tent. Then you prepare your breakfast, the food rations that you have. Then you quickly look at your time, then you figure out your routes, you kind of go over your route real quick. But I mean, remembering that, most of the route I have set up weeks in advance, but you just do a double check the temperature, and then you just do your walk. But you do your walk as soon as possible. So that whole process alone takes about 1 hour. And then you're going through these places, then, get ready to be stared at by a million people, get ready to be like asked to come and have tea or come chill with somebody, especially in busy areas. And I think the most exciting parts are usually when you arrive in what's it called? When you arrive in a town or a village, and you're surrounded by hundreds. One time, I was even surrounded by 1,000 people. Like the entire village came, and you have to basically stay calm and stay cool. And this is like a daily thing. And you get to a point where you actually become used to that kind of behavior from people. And that's the weird part, is when you can stay calm and cool in like a chaotic situation. where everyone's confused and the town and the villages and the people are just kind of looking at you going, who is this guy? And then the police come taking you, having questions, and then the chief of the village comes and he talks to you. All these are pretty amazing experiences.
I can imagine that would be I know you said you got used to it, but it could be almost like a mental strain because you're constantly being the new person. Like every few weeks or every couple of days, you're constantly the new person in a situation.
Constantly.
You're never in a place, long enough to really feel like, okay, I know my ins and outs or this, that. So that it's a lot.
Exactly.
It takes a strong person to be able to do that.
It's really intense in the sense that, yeah, it is and it can get really straining. That's the worst part. Is it gets incredibly straining every single day. You have to kind of because you know how hard it is to like always be like the new guy in a village or a town or city or wherever. It's like, imagine you moving to a new city every single day, and you gotta like get out your luggage. You have to like meet new people. Who are the cool people in town? Who are you gonna hang out with? So if you do that constantly, yeah, it can really make you tired at one point. Like you turn into a zombie at one stage. I was pretty much walking without a soul. I was just kind of like a dead body, like just moving mechanically.
Yeah. Yeah, there was one point I was reading through your blog, and I think it might have been your birthday, and you mentioned you were like, all I want right now is a silent room and some darkness. That's all I want
Yeah.
for my birthday. So I can imagine, like, just constantly being on display also
Mm.
takes a toll on you. But coming out of that now and looking back, do you feel like it's made you a better man at all? Or I know it's made you a better traveler, but are those skills that you now apply in your day to day?
Absolutely. I use those. Basically, what I learned is I take that to the schools. I do talks at, so I do a talk at a school every other day. And in fact, I just came from one, the school that I used to go to called Provo Primary in Turks and Caicos. And all these kids, they're so young, and nobody would think like, oh, they're going to be into this. But that, at least I thought that before I started doing talks. And they get so interested, they're so intrigued, and it's because like I'm tapping into like the real human way of being, which is tapping into curiosity, tapping into kind of this innate sensation of I want to explore and I want to experience. And I think kids really get that. And that's not just kids. I think a lot of people do actually are fascinated by it. It's like a wide spectrum of people. So I even do talks at corporate events and things like that. And it's just basically, how do you overcome? How do you persevere? How do you keep challenging yourself in such a difficult situation, like getting shot at, then arrested, and then nearly drowning all within like a month? How do you do that? What brings you up? What makes you brush off your shoulders and keep it going? Like even in Sudan, I was hardly anyone is speaking English there, at least in the rural areas, and they still asked me to do a TED talk. I'm doing TED talks in front of people that don't even understand me, and yet there are like hundreds of them waiting for you to like speak, even though they don't get what you're saying, which I found very fascinating.
And looking back now, are you glad that you did this trip by yourself, or do you feel like you missed out on some things by not having a person to kind of bounce, immediate reactions or emotions off of during this 2 years?
No, I think everything that I did, the way I did it, I think is ideal. I wouldn't change it for anything. I think the length was perfect. I think being solo was perfect because then you can like link with people, you can separate, you can kind of maneuver your way around. You're a lot more flexible. But if you're with somebody from the beginning, over 2 years, you can kind of like go different directions. Like in a relationship, some people might stay the course, but then your partner might see something else and be inspired about something else and can go a completely different course.
So you mentioned you almost drowning, being arrested, being shot at, and earlier you mentioned a conflict zone. Are these things that all happen at the same time? I know you mentioned they were in the same month. So let's go into that a little bit. Tell us about you being arrested.
So being arrested was probably one of the angriest times of my times during the travel. What happened was I kayaked along this village in Malawi, near a place called Chichua, and it's completely remote. There are no roads that go to this village. There are no roads there. The only way you can get there is by boat or kayak, and that's if you know where to look. So some of these kids have literally never seen a foreigner before, and so I went there, and there's usually one person that speaks English in any village, and this guy who was my translator was drunk out of his mind. Like he was just like he couldn't even walk properly, and most chiefs that I've met don't actually speak English because they're so entrenched into their culture and their tribe. I mean, that's one of the reasons why they're chiefs. He was translating everything I said to him, but what would take me 5 seconds to say would take him about 30 minutes to translate. And sometimes there would even be arguments, and there would be times where the chief is like grabbing my kayak and like angrily storming off with it, and I'd be like, "What is going on? This is crazy." And then he settles me down. He says like, "Okay, everything's okay. It's okay. Just rest, sleep here, and you'll be fine." So about a couple of hours later, after going into like deep sleep mode, the basically I saw two flashlights going into my tent and zipped down, and two AK-47s pointing down at me, and it was police officers, and they were saying you're under arrest. The reason for that was it could be because they were trying to bribe me, but the excuse was that I was different in a sense, and they thought I was lying. I told them, I said, "Here's my passport. Look at this. Like I'm not from here. I'm just a traveler. I'm just visiting, kind of thing." And they didn't believe me. The police officer looks at me and he looks at my arm and he looks at his arm and he says, "Look, we are the same. You are from Africa." And I was like, "What?" It's like this guy cannot be serious right now. It's like my passport says. So what he thought was that either I was like a refugee or escaping somewhere, Mozambique or something like that, or he thought I was, a convict, anything like that. So it was really like worst case scenarios.
So you said Mozambique. This was fairly early on in your trip then. If they thought that you were from somewhere that wasn't that far away.
That's the thing. But in Mozambique itself, I was also kind of like called out all the time, like on the street. Police officers would always stop me and they'd be like, show me your ID, show me your passport. Because I look slightly different. The thing is in America and in the Caribbean as well as South America, these are the places where slaves from West Africa were taken. And the difference between us here and Africans in the West or in the East is that you have villages and towns, even cities, sometimes even entire countries where everyone has a similar look. If you look at the Germans, for instance, they have a particular look compared to the Italians. The Italians have a certain look. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So that is the case in Africa as well, and that's how they could tell that I am different or I'm foreigner, and so they get kind of nervous about that. Xenophobia is a huge problem in some parts, particularly East Africa, because of a lot of the conflicts that are happening at the moment. So that was a struggle. So they arrested me, they put the handcuffs on me, and they put me in jail. But the funny thing is, and it's not quite so funny, but the thing that really got me angry was that they kept these handcuffs, and they were shackled handcuffs, not the flexible ones with the chain in between. So they were shackled, so you can't move your arm. It was stiff, and they kept that on me for 2 nights while I was in jail. And they didn't loosen it. It took them a while to loosen it, but one of the inmates had to basically tell the officers, like, "Hey, can you help this guy?" When you get to the point where your inmates start helping you or start feeling sorry for you, then you know that you're not being treated right.
Wait a minute. So you this wasn't just we arrest you and we take you down to booking
No,
and let you out. You were in
no,
there
no, no.
for 3 days?
Yeah, 3 nights.
Wow. So okay. So how do you get out of this situation? What was the resolution?
I was incredibly lucky. So by the way, this is in Malawi, and I kayaked Malawi. And while I was kayaking, there was this Italian guy that said he wanted to join me. So he was about 3 days behind me. And because kayaking is a straight line, it's a lot, it's a lot faster in terms of the distance that I'm taking. Not necessarily faster in terms of movement, but in terms of the distance, a lot shorter. So he walked, and so he was always a little bit behind, and he finally caught up. And they knew right away that this guy's with me because there are no foreigners that come to these areas at all ever. So they were like, "Hey, your friend is in jail. You should go check him out." And so he did that, and right away, he looked at them and he said, "Hey, you can't have this guy in jail." And just like that, they actually let me go. They didn't believe me, but they believed him.
And that's a whole another avenue of discussion as to
Exactly. Yeah.
why
Exactly.
that
Exactly.
was. That's so
Yeah.
crazy.
Yeah. It is crazy.
So as you're walking out of jail after your third night in there, what keeps you from not hopping on a plane and going back home?
But the thing is, what motivated me was basically just to finish. And the more people try to stop me, the more I felt compelled to finish. It's like this like, how there's like the superpower. I think there's a superhero where if you throw power at him, or whatever, fireballs at him, it actually energizes him even more. So that's how I felt when people try to stop me. It energized me more. It kept me fueled, and it motivated me to really figure it out. My main thing is I love to figure things out. I love to find a big challenge, and I love to see how I can overcome it, or how we can solve the problem. To me, that's like the best time I could have. Not that I was having a great time in jail, but that was torture. But I was definitely like kind of meditating in the jail cell, and I was really thinking about, you know, what am I going to do to get out of the situation. So I, and the thing is, I didn't really come up with anything until my friend came and picked me up, basically.
Shout out to your Italian friend for coming at the time that he did. But I'm glad you brought him up because a lot of times when we hear about experiences such as yours, like if we were just to read the title, man takes a 2-year trek by foot through the continent of Africa, we wouldn't expect to see Mario Rigby, black man. It's
Exactly.
it's just not what we see. So why is it important for you to take such a trip, to be, a black person taking this trip through Africa? What was the
Yeah.
importance of that to you?
That was very important to me, actually. That was one of the things that I didn't want to, like. I never, like, if you look at my blogs and if you look at the things I write and stuff, I never really mention race or anything like that. But because it's already so obvious that I believe that people would bring up that topic anyways, so I never really had to push it or to say it. But the reason I think it's really important is because we need to change the face of what it is to be an explorer. An explorer is basically someone who discovers a land that is either unknown or unexplored in a sense. But I have a new definition of what it means to be an explorer, which is we need to empower ourselves. And I think expeditions really help in that sense. Like, you should have seen the faces of those kids that I did talks at the school, especially like the little black kids. They're just like, "Damn, man, you could do that? Like, anything's possible." And I had to walk across Africa. I couldn't do South Africa. I couldn't do one country. I had to do all of the country. I had to go from the bottom to the top because the severity of this needed to be so big and so difficult that the next person who's going to do this is probably going to be like in the next 20 years. I mean, hopefully sooner, but it has to be so difficult that when I tell people this, they have to be shocked. And that carries on over to what it is to be a black person. And what it is basically, we are all, technically, we all the same. And what I'm trying to do is normalize things that we don't particularly do, but put that out there on the map so that other black people, people of minority, even women, can go out there and do the things that they would love to do, but society tells them no, it's not possible. No, black people don't do that. I don't believe in that. I do not believe in that at all. I think that black people, I think we could be the greatest explorers. In fact, we have a lot of great athletic capabilities. We're very creative thinkers. You put all of that together, and you could build a great explorer.
Yeah, no, I agree. A lot of the work, and if you're listening and you're not familiar, one of the other things that I do is Black and Abroad, and a lot of the work that my co-founder Eric and I have done with Black and Abroad is to show that there are people like Mario out there. There are people who are taking these really unique experiences and sharing their stories that was what immediately compelled me to your story is because I felt even though it was something that was so grand, I felt a immediate connection because I knew what that space felt like, and I knew what work was going into it, and I knew that you would have a different perspective on this kind of experience, even if we've seen this
Mm,
kind of experience before. There's a
yeah.
different story to be told that doesn't get told that often, and
Mm,
I've worked really hard to put light onto those stories, stories like yours and like you said, so that people can see themselves in these experiences, and know that you can be the explorers. I think of a friend of mine, Jessica Nabango, who's currently on her way to becoming the first Black woman to go to every single country in the world. So to see that story,
and I've seen actually there's actually a few girls who are doing that right now. A few black girls who are on. I think there's one that I think the one you're talking about. She's like 103 or 106 right now.
yeah, she
And
crested over 100 sometime this year, and she's on a roll. I think she set
yeah,
her goal is by next May to have them all done.
yeah. And then there's another girl too. I forget her name, but I'm also following her, and they're following me back on Instagram as well. And so there's a few people doing. What I realize is that when you're doing something, there's always a few people doing it as well in the background. Like even right now, there's a couple actually who are attempting to walk across Africa at the moment. I don't know how likely they're going to make it because I think they're just at this point where they just said, you know what, we're not going to do the whole continent. And while I was doing this, there were at least three other people attempting this, but none of them had like kind of gone through it. So they've all kind of quit or they had difficulties at one point along the way. So I consider myself incredibly lucky to be able to finish this.
Mario, very often when we, take a trip or we're going on some kind of exploration or travel experience, we have an idea of that place before we get there. And either that idea gets confirmed once we get there or it completely flipped on its head. So, in your situation, what was an experience you had during your trip that made you rethink your previous understanding of Africa as a whole or as one of the countries within Africa?
I think flying into South Africa was quite kind of a shock because South Africa is quite developed. So it's like Eurasia. And that's one thing. But then you take a turn to the left or to the right, like, we're talking like a few hundred meters away. And then there's a township that's like one of the worst townships on the planet with poverty that is so bad that there were times where I had to literally climb garbage to get to this person's house who I was sleeping at in the township. Because I slept everywhere. I've even slept on the streets in the township. And this is like top 10 most dangerous places in the world. It was a pretty tough challenge to see. You know, I'm staying at a mansion one night, and then all of a sudden I'm staying in the township in the slums on the street the next night. So it was a complete change up every single moment, every single time. And that's something that really shocked me was just that the fact that these no like nobody cares about these people. They just kind of like left them out on the streets like that. Like you've seen it on TV and stuff like that. You see it, but when you are in it, it's a whole new ball game. You want to do something, and then you start getting angry at people that just kind of like walk around like aloof, who have like all the riches in the world, and they just kind of like don't care. Particularly, I'm talking about are black people. who just kind of like look at other black people and they say, you know what, well, you weren't fortunate enough, and well, I earned this. I'm like, that's not what it's about. What it's about is to empower humanity. We are a single race, and we need to stop calling each other different races because we as a whole are a race. So to me, one of the most shocking things that I've seen was the amount of unfairness that I've seen played groups of people just because of A, their history, or B, because of their skin colors or something like that.
Is there is there a country that now looking back, you're like, you know what, I don't ever need to visit that place again?
Well, I mean, Malawi was a bit of a challenge. It was kind of tough to go back, especially I wanted to leave right away after I got arrested there. But you know, the Malawian government, they actually made a apology on behalf of the police force that were there. So they basically gave me a note that made me invincible. But I was ready to leave, not just because of that, but because of the poverty level that was in Malawi. You know, I thought I could have been ready for that, but I really wasn't. Because you know, if you have a car, if you drive, or if you take a plane or safari, whatever, or if you stay for a couple of weeks, it's okay. You can go, you can look at this place, and you're like, oh look, there's a bunch of poor people, it's whatever, and then you take a Range Rover and you leave the place or you leave the country. But I didn't have that choice. Everywhere I went, I had to basically eat their food, and you know, eating the same food all the time, you know, I started to feel like I was becoming like them. Like I started to lose weight. I was beginning to like lose energy, and everything felt the same over and over. It's a monoculture. Nothing changes. If you go from one town to the next, the only change you'll probably see is maybe the scenery.
Mario, tell us one thing people never hear about when they're learning about an experience such as yours, because we've seen these stories before, and we've seen these experiences, but a lot of times it gets painted in a certain light, and very rarely does it dig into maybe the darker side or the unpleasant side of this experience. So, what's an ugly side that no one really sees? I mean, you clearly had them with being arrested and being shot at, but is there something personally that, really doesn't get conveyed in these stories when we talk about these?
You know what? Getting shot at by rebels and being arrested in the Malawi, they were not actually the worst scenarios for me. There was actually some. I say personally, I have met some people. Like for instance, I met some people in Malawi and some people in where was it? Or in Kenya. I have met some people that are like, you know, proper bad people. You know, you think you met bad people until like you met these guys, and you know, they're the ones who basically are in power and they abuse power, and because you know the way that it happens in Africa, for most parts of Africa, the reason I say Africa is because it is generalized, yes, because that is true. For most parts of Africa, is that they have a kind of a small village or small town mentality in most parts, unless you're in the big cities like Addis Ababa or you know Maputo in Mozambique. But the way that you receive a chief is usually through family descendancy, and this chief is basically kind of pampered throughout his entire life. And you know the way that you appease him is by giving him gifts, and he starts to feel like this is an obligation for everybody, even if they're the poorest of the poor of the poor, because they themselves believe that the poor are there to serve the rich. In fact, the white South Africans, the Afrikaners, actually believe that. I went to a church in South Africa where they were talking about that. They invited me as an outside guest. They didn't even see me as a black man. They saw me as a European. And so they always say, they're like, oh, you're not really a black, you're a European. So I'd be like, okay, that's interesting. So I just played the game and I joined them, and they literally would say things like, and remember, some of these white Afrikaners, they don't even speak English, right? Like we're
Right.
talking like they're out there. They would say stuff like, "Oh yeah, you know that by the will of God, the blacks are there to serve with the whites." And I was just like, yo, this is like, you believe, like, they are actually talking about this in churches.
And feeling comfortable enough to say it around you because they have categorized you as non-black at this point.
That's what I'm saying, right? So they truly, truly believe this. And I couldn't get angry at them. At this point, I think when I was there, I couldn't get angry. But what I just saw at this moment in time, I really saw the disconnect in humanity, how we think we're separate, and we make a big deal about it. Like, like we have like Asian culture, we have European culture, and then we have African culture. And we like, what is that? At one point in time, we all literally came from Africa. We can take our DNA. If you took your DNA, your blood samples will go back as far as anywhere from 20 to 50,000 years ago. It will link back to Africa at one point, and a small tribe of people. Those are the same people that Europeans are made of, same place where Chinese are made from, the same place where Brazilian, everybody. And then we fabricate these lies and these things to basically empower just a few people. And those few people are benefiting from us fighting each other and looking at each other and saying, you're this, you're that. And the only people that are really hurting from this is ourselves, the majority, like 95% of the human population. And some of some of these people who believe that they're chiefs, but they're in politics. So they take their chief mentality and they bring it into politics. So you have these guys who believe that, okay, I am here because of the will of God. I'm not talking about white South Africans now. I'm talking about like Kenyan leaders and things like that, who truly believe that they are political powerheads because they were chosen by the will of God. And, they would calmly talk to me and say, you know what, Mario, like, I don't really kill people anymore because it's because it's expensive. It's not financially feasible to keep murdering people.
Not because it's good or bad or right or wrong, but because it's expensive.
They don't see that. It's not. It's and you know what, and then you got to sit there and you got to play cool, right? You got to be like, oh, okay, cool, cool, yeah, yeah, yeah. It's like real expensive these days. The tax. So, well, you laugh at it, but what I'm doing is I'm surviving, and surviving is adapting to your environment, and that's actually probably one of the most important roles that I have ever learned is being able to not be afraid of even the most evil people. Because think about this, just because you're evil doesn't mean that you're evil toward me. How can you get that person to be on your side? And that's, again, always figuring things out. So, how do you get this guy to be on your good side? Because I'm vulnerable. I'm a lone guy walking with a backpack on the road. He could easily just hit me with a car, shoot me, whatever. You know what I mean? So how do you adapt yourself?
That's a survival tactic that I'm sure most of us don't have to put into play in our regular day to days. But yeah, I think
No.
of I think of those moments that I've had where it's kind of you hear it come in and you're like, I can't react to this. I cannot physically react to this.
Exactly.
And you feel even more exposed going forward because you're like, what's about to be said next? I have no idea where this is going to go from here. Yeah, that I can't imagine. Kudos to you for being able to ride through those moments. And on that note, we're going to take a brief break, but we'll be right back to wrap up this episode of Ungentrified after a word from one of our sponsors. This episode of Ungentrified is brought to you by Black and Abroad. Black and Abroad is an online travel community dedicated to inspiring and celebrating the experiences of Black travelers and expats. Interested in traveling with a handpicked group of individuals just like you? Check out Black and Abroad's curated travel experiences in destinations worldwide. Upcoming trips include Cartagena in June and Johannesburg in December for Afropunk. You can find out more about Black and Abroad and its upcoming journeys by visiting weareblackandabroad.com. Looking back, this is about 6-7 months after your return. What's it feel like to be back home now, or in a home feeling space? What does it feel like?
It feels quite refreshing, actually. Like, I haven't been back to Turks and Caicos in probably, like, I lived here 18 years ago, and I visited about 10 years ago. But it's really strange to see like all these new faces, and because when I last lived in Turks and Caicos, like the population was so small, and you knew everybody, and you knew every store. My parents, they owned a bunch of restaurants. They still own restaurants around here. So like even my family, they're really well known, and so everywhere I go, basically, I have to hide out sometimes, and they go like, "Oh yeah, I remember when you were like a little kid, like you were like knee high." So I keep getting that, and it's funny to see their expression or their reaction, because they knew you when you were a kid, and then all of a sudden you come back and you're like this guy that just did the most impossible thing, and you made it possible. I don't know. It's a really strange experience. Really, it's to say it's a bit fascinating to say the least.
Now that everything is kind of sunk in, what was your favorite moment during those 2 years?
I would say my favorite moments. Actually, you know what? I always had like a smile on my face when like the beginning parts of my walk, like within the first 2 hours, when there's just like nice breeze. It's like always the breeze. It was always like a nice piece of breeze that like that got me like smiling and feeling good. It makes you feel alive. Besides that, I think it was just being able to meet all these different kinds of people, and and you get to a point where you start to understand humanity. You get it. It's We are shaped by our environment. We are shaped by system. You wear the clothes you wear not because you chose. I think we all think that we're choosing who we are, but no, we are, to a certain extent we are, but we are all part of a systematic kind of like what do you call it, pre-selection in a sense. If you were growing up in this kind of family, a wealthier family, you are more likely to be kind of in that environment, and therefore you're going to be nurtured that way. If you're raised in a poor environment, then you're more likely to be raised that way as well, and you will raise your children this way. And understanding patterns, all people have patterns. I've noticed about 12 different patterns that human beings have, in which you could easily detect. And this is something that I kind of took note of when I did the African tour. And this is probably the best way to read people, is by looking at how they respond to situations, how they respond to your tone of voice, how they respond to the people around them, and what clothes they're wearing, and all like little intricate things. You become like a crazy detective psychologist in a way, not because that's what you wanted to do, but that's what you have to do in order to survive. And the better you are a detective, the more likely you're not going to perish.
Please tell me that you're writing a book about these 12 personalities that you figured out. You got to document that in some way.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, I'm writing two books at the moment. One is kind of like a picture book, and the other one is more like a novel type book. And I think I might do a third book, which is a children's book, which I think is going to be very important for, I think, our future generations. We think that like people, it would just be black children that look up to this, but it's not really. Like, I'm going to all these different schools. I'm going to, just going to Provo Primary. It's like really mixed. It's kind of like the prestigious primary school that you can go to, and that it's a majority actually foreign kids. They're the ones that are actually like really looking up, and this like super bleach blonde kid comes up to me. He's like, "You're my hero, and that's so cool what you're doing." And so I think especially children, they don't see color, they don't see race. It's just that when we become adults, we become dumber and dumber in a sense. And we think, and we take the stuff too serious, and then we act as if we're mature by acting serious, and keeping ourselves composed in the sense. And I think the more selfish you play, and I think the more you're willing to gamble against humanity, I think that's the outcome that's going to happen. So I think I choose the opposite.
That's a good way to close that out. So, Mario, before I let you go and enjoy the rest of your vacation back home, what would you say to the person who's thinking about going on and embarking on a journey like yours? What advice would you give them?
To never really be like, it's okay to be afraid. It's okay to have a fear. Don't let fear run your decisions. Absolutely, do not let fear run your decisions.
Mario, I want to thank you so much for taking your time out to share your experience with us. Please tell the people where they can find you and what you have coming next.
Absolutely. So again, thanks again for having me on the show. Really appreciate that, and it kind of shows that we are in a community. We as Black people in the community, we're looking to stretch. We're looking to spread our wings, and I think what you're doing is you're helping other people stretch and take their wings out and fly. One of the next projects that I'm doing is actually in sustainable energy. So I want to take an electric vehicle and circumnavigate Africa, starting in Europe, and then I would be the first human being to actually take an electric car and circumnavigate Africa. And I think that challenge is more of a technical challenge as opposed to a perseverance challenge or physical challenge, in the sense that there are no charging stations and there are no electric cars in Africa. So how do you overcome that? And again, to me, it's just a problem that needs to be solved. And because people are not solving it, I'm just going to do it myself. And that's just how it is.
Yeah, and that's a problem that would need to be solved anyway. So I'm glad that you've taken
Exactly.
first steps towards that.
I've already started talking to satellite dish companies that basically survey Africa to see where the hotspots are for solar stations for future projects, to build like the solar road, basically. Not a solar road, but to build a road and implement, instead of gas stations, solar stations. I'm hoping to partner up with people like Elon Musk and Akon. Akon is doing a huge initiative in solar energy around Africa. He has housed more than 100 million people. That is single-handedly more than any NGO on the planet, but that doesn't get any recognition, understandably so.
Right. And in the amount of time that he's done it is
Exactly.
and they can find out more about your last 2 years and what you have coming forward at your website, right? And
Yeah.
that is
MarioRigby.com, or check out my Instagram, which is also Mario Rigby. Twitter, Mario Rigby, just my first and last name for any social media platform.
Thank you, Mario. And of course, you can find Ungentrified at our website, ungentrifiedpodcast.com. We're also on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at ungentrifiedpod. You can find me, your host, at Kent_ESQ on both Instagram and Twitter. Thank you guys for listening. Of course, if you like what you're hearing, give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts or whatever platform you're listening to. If you've already done that and you're looking for another way to support, share this episode and our other episodes with your friends and get them listening as well. Mario, thanks again. I'm so grateful that you were able to carve some time out of your trip in Turks and Caicos and get back to the sun and enjoying your time.
I appreciate it so much. Thank you so much for having me on the show. And yeah, I'm going to give you those 5 stars as well.
I appreciate that. Thanks again.
Thank you.